Well, law section 4.5, constitutionalism in England. This is a very tough section to kind of get a handle on. There's a lot of detail to it, so I've simplified a lot of things here. It's very important for this section that we kind of go over what's important here. So, first of all, we're looking for reasons for conflict between King Charles I and Parliament throughout the English Civil War. We look at the impact that Oliver Cromwell makes on English culture and economics, and then the reasons for the Glorious Revolution, the impact of the English Bill of Rights. Again, there's a lot of detail in this section you can get bogged down on. Remember what is important. That's those things right here. So first of all, what is England, or what makes England different than the rest of the countries in Europe at this time, with the slight exception of the Netherlands? We're talking Western Europe for the most part. They have a system called constitutionalism, which powers of the monarch are limited by law. And in England, you have your monarch, and then you have Parliament. Parliament's your legislative body that basically makes the laws, raises the money, and also not added here, but also to add to it, the monarch can dissolve Parliament, meaning that if the monarch doesn't like what Parliament's doing or doesn't have a need for them at that certain point in time, the monarch can dissolve Parliament and send them home. It has to call them back either to get new laws or raise money, but they, or the monarch rather, that he or she can send Parliament at home anytime. So, with that in mind, we've got a little bit more here on the English's society in the 17th century. The first thing to note is that in Parliament, it's kind of dark in here. It's on the other side. Hello, Piper. Hello. Okay, so it's just not working. Okay, so let's just do this. All right, so the gentry are in Parliament. The gentry, the nobles, most of them are Calvinists. So in England, we call Calvinists Puritan. So there's your little profile of what is challenging the king or queen's authority. Is a noble that is most of them being Calvinists. Now, they're willing to pay taxes as long as their voice is heard by the king. Now, in England, though, most of your religious climate is made up by the Church of England, okay, the Anglican Church. However, you do have Catholic sympathizers. You also obviously have these Calvinists, these Puritans, most of them, and well, not most, but at least some of them in powerful positions in Parliament. So it's kind of a complicated religious situation. It's certainly a more complicated political situation than in many other countries because you have that connection between the monarch and Parliament. So with that in mind, where we left off last time with England at the end of the 16th century is with our girl, Elizabeth I. She dies and is replaced by James I. Okay, he represents the Stuart family. They come down from Scotland to become the new monarchy. And James is Anglican and anti-Puritan. So he really didn't like the Calvinists, but he is extremely divine right. He claims that philosophy, and if you're divine right, then why do you have to do with Parliament? They're kind of in my way. So James ends up dying. He doesn't really play a huge role in things, but his son Charles is going to be the big story. Charles is going to claim divine right even more seriously than his father, and he also starts to issue some policies that are kind of Catholic leaning. And for Parliament, which is primarily Calvinist, that is an issue even more than an Anglican king. They don't like, certainly, a Catholic king. Charles is going to conflict with Parliament over money to fight wars. He wants wars to fight some countries that might increase or help Catholic influence in some places. Parliament doesn't like that. And Parliament's like, hey, dude, we don't think you should have this money to fight this war. We don't agree with it. Charles is like, okay, I'll send you home. Remember, the king can dissolve Parliament, and Charles regularly sends home Parliament. He also refuses to go along with what's called the Petition of Right. Parliament's a little nervous that Charles is going to assert even more royal authority if he believes in divine right so heavily. So they try to get him to sign this document, which is going to restrict some of his rights as king. And then they would say, okay, we'll pay for your wars. But Charles even wasn't interested in doing that. He's like, you even shouldn't be talking to me, right? I mean, why are you even here? So Charles sends Parliament home for like 10 years. But eventually he has to call them back. And if we look here at probably Charles's most famous portrait, he believes, again, that kings are not bound to the people or to Parliament. They're bound to God alone. And that's all they have to answer to, is not Parliament, not to the people, but to the big guy upstairs. So eventually Charles has to call back Parliament. And Parliament, again, is difficult with him, saying, we are not here to be your yes men. So Charles attempts to arrest members of Parliament in session. And that eventually triggers the English Civil War. Of course, in class we watched that video of Charles dramatically walking into Parliament, something illegal if you're not invited. But Charles is brought in, and then he, or brings himself in, tries to arrest a couple members of Parliament. They leave and get out of the way. Then eventually Civil War is declared. In this Civil War, you got two sides. You got the Cavaliers, which support the king. Okay, and there you see maybe some of the types of people who would also support the king. But you also have the Roundheads, and this is Parliament's side that oppose the king. And these Roundheads are, well, they're roundheadish. They got the bowl cut. It kind of looks like I have a bowl cut here, but do not be dismayed. It's not a bowl cut. But these men and women oppose the king, and they oppose royal authority. So you've got Puritans, Scotland, which Charles had attempted to fight in a war, middle-class new gentry. Very much it's old money versus new money in this Civil War. As the Civil War goes on, it's clear that Parliament's side is going to win. Again, our emphasis is not on like what happens during the war, but it's on the fact that, hey, the war happened, now let's see what happens after. They're led by a man named Oliver Cromwell, who is a Puritan Calvinist military leader and also member of Parliament. And what he is able to do is not only assert authority on the battlefield, which helps Parliament win, but also off it as well, as he has exiled from Parliament all non-Puritans. Okay, so basically if you're an Anglican or even a Catholic that is in Parliament, there weren't many of those, but if they were there, this Puritan Parliament now is going to exile all other religious groups. So this is not only a political thing led by Parliament against the king, but also the Puritans, the Calvinists, are trying to assert their authority as well. And in order to kind of bring down the hammer, so to speak, on Charles and royal authority, Cromwell and the rest of Parliament's leaders declare Charles an enemy of the state. And after the war ends and the king loses, the king also loses his head. And here is Cromwell looking very much like some sort of ferret or giraffe or something, with a very long neck, I think. But Cromwell asserts Parliament's authority by ending the life of King Charles. And this is probably the most famous depiction of it, the world's worst illustration, I would say, with the floating hat. But the point, again, is this. What were the reasons for conflict in the English Civil War? Is that question of authority. And then as the English Civil War plays out, you have the death of Charles I. So in our country, right? So we've got the kind of the battle for authority between our three branches of government. Even though our Constitution is there to limit the powers of all three, sometimes those two branches or even all three branches clash to be able to do one thing or another. So in England, 130 or so years before the formation of our country, you have the two sides, the king and Parliament, clashing, and that ending in civil war. And then you have the death of the king. So after the death of Charles I, what happens at that point? You have a period called the interregnum, or between kings. And in that period, Cromwell, the military leader for Parliament, rises up to become what's known as Lord Protector. In essence, he will serve as military dictator. And as that point, he wants to implement Calvinist reforms. Much like Calvin did in Geneva, he wants to bring in Calvinist Puritan reforms so that England is ruled basically as a Puritan state. What does that mean? You're restricting behaviors that you see potentially as morally incorrect. No dancing, no singing, secular singing, no acting, no competitive sports. Even Christmas gets the axe because of its secular overtones at the time. Cromwell wants to take all the distraction out of society because he sees the Charles I England as a representation of sin taking over the country. So he wants to take all those distractions out so that people can focus on what is important. Consequently, at the same time, Cromwell leads military expeditions in Scotland and Ireland to enforce English control In Ireland, there's a good story of parts of the New Model Army, his army, capturing the Irish leader who wore a wooden leg. And then they took the leg off of this guy while interrogating him and capturing him and like beat him over the head with it. It's a fun tale. Unless you're that guy, I guess you get splinters on your face. But in any case, this is Cromwell's intent to model this behavior. And this illustration that we looked at briefly in some classes is certainly an anti-Cromwell appearance, because here's our boy right here basically ordering the chopping down of this tree, which is known as the royal oak of Brittany. The royal oak, it's this large oak tree where it's represented the monarchy, and Cromwell, by killing it, has basically chopped down the authority that has grown over time to represent such a vibrant English state. And this right here, he's standing on this doorway to what looks to be hell. And the translation is slippery door or slippery slope. So what Cromwell's doing is perhaps leading England toward further damage. And as time goes on, it's clear Cromwell's probably not the answer. And as he dies, and incredibly unpopular in some circles, the Parliament has a decision. They're like, well, do we continue with a kind of a Cromwell dynasty or a military dictatorship, or do we go back to the way that it was, seeing that the English people are kind of upset at this point in time? So they give a call to the son of the dead king. That's the son of Charles I. His name becomes Charles II. And they invite him to become the new king. And this is known as the Restoration. However, for Charles II to become the restored king, so we're going to do a little scene change here, Parliament basically says, Parliament basically says, listen, Charles, if you're going to come in as king, you've got to agree to a set of rules. You can't do this, this, and this, further establishing Parliament's dominance. But as time goes on, Charles II, kind of like his father, starts to display a few authoritarian tendencies, and it's nothing too major. But, for example, he was going to end up barring the Puritans, of course, responsible for so much of the Civil War with Cromwell, but he's going to bar Puritans from serving in public roles. And he also has some Catholic leanings. So he actually works out a secret deal with Louis XIV, who happened to be his cousin, to restrict or to relax, rather, Catholic, anti-Catholic laws in England, kind of take those away so that well, let me reset. I got distracted by life. Okay, whatever. He got a law done with, or a deal done with Louis XIV to basically say, okay, Charles II will relax anti-Catholic laws, and France will give England money. So Louis basically paying England money to be nice to Catholics. The problem with that for Parliament and for England is that if you have a king who is more friendly to the church, you might get a king that listens to the Pope over the English people. That's the fear. Okay, get my glasses off. There's a glare. I can't see it. I have a squint. Okay, so that's the fear, is that if you have a Catholic leader, they're going to be more loyal to the Pope than they are to the English people. Well, guess what? Charles II dies, and then his brother, James II, takes over. And this guy is an unapologetic, strong Catholic who listens to the Pope. Hey, Pope, I got you. That's what he does. Okay, and look at him. Nobody likes James. Okay? And it's clear for Parliament that this guy, who's big on divine right, who's a major Catholic, this is a toxic combination that will only bring pain and suffering to England. So what do you do if you're Parliament? You've already dismissed one king by exiting him off at the neck. What do you do with him? This guy. Well, we have something is called the Glorious Revolution. Parliament calls the King of the Netherlands. His name is William of Orange. And they say, William, hey, bud, would you like, as a Protestant, to come be the King of England? And guess what? You can bring your wife, Mary, with you, and you'll be a dual monarch, William and Mary. This kind of worked by the law because Mary was James II's daughter. Okay? A little connection there in the family shrub. So in any case, William is invited over, and he accepts the throne, and Parliament drives James II out. Nobody was willing to fight for James because nobody liked him. So what this does is that it establishes Parliament even more so in charge because they dictated who is going to rule. It's called the Glorious Revolution because there's very little bloodshed at all, and everyone is pretty pleased, except for James, of course. And here's William and Mary looking very much like the same person. A further, though, note that Parliament told William and Mary is that when they came in, William and Mary said, all right, you can come in, or Parliament said, you can come in, William and Mary, and be our king and queen, but you have to sign the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights. And in that English Bill of Rights, there were several provisions that allowed Parliament to have rights that were protected by the law. Okay, and a lot of them you see there, but also due process of law, no cruel and unusual punishment, no excessive bail. It's a lot of First Amendment or the First Bill of Rights things that we see here in the United States. There also was the right to bear arms, but only for Protestants. Catholics could not shoot. And then also the king legally could not be a Catholic. It was put in the Bill of Rights, and that is still a thing beholden in England today, is that the king and queen, the royal family, cannot and are not Catholic. So the legacy of all of this century, okay? Here's kind of the big take-home points. The Civil War and the Glorious Revolution protect the rights of the gentry, the nobility, and the aristocracy, the nobility, from absolute rulers. This is not democracy. This is not giving rights to the people. This is not giving votes. This protects wealthy landowners against the powers of the monarch. Okay? Contrast that with what's happening in France. We have the kings, the Bourbon kings living in Versailles, and you got the nobles who basically swarm to them. It also establishes a constitutional monarchy in England, where you see power fully set in the monarch, or fully in Parliament, and the monarch is basically there limited by the Constitution. You also see the beginning of transfer from the king as executive authority to the prime minister. Now, the way that it develops in England in terms of the government system is that the cabinet becomes powerful. I feel like things coming out of my head. Look at that. Isn't that cool? That's awesome. I can see it. I got like dog ears or something. Anyway, you've got Parliament. You've got the king, but what develops is a body called the cabinet, which is full of members of Parliament that come in and do the work of the king in an executive role. The prime minister is the leader of that cabinet. All of this has to be done at the permission of the king, and that is still done today. Like the king and the queen still give permission to the cabinet and the prime minister to form a government, but it's all traditional, it's all symbolic today. The power of a leadership is in that cabinet. The last thing to note is that what we see in England at this point is also being mirrored a little bit in the Netherlands. The Dutch Republic, or the Netherlands, mirrors this shift. But again, it's the people with money that have the power. It's not democracy. It's not voting. It's not people ruling and selecting their own rulers. It may not be absolute monarchy, but it is certainly not democracy. It's kind of a hybrid where you have limits on the power of the monarchy there, but it's the people, the wealthy landowners, that are in control. All right, so that is 4.5. I could have taken a lot longer on that, but, you know, I love and respect your time. Make sure in your review book that you kind of are in the sheet that you may have received that you reinforce these ideas. And again, here's kind of the big 3 things that you need to be able to flesh out and know. Okay, that's England. When we come back to England, well, they'll be doing other things. So, ciao.